We're going to start the.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Bostic, and we are so excited that you've joined us for tonight's Connecting Families that the Federation for Children with Special Health Needs sponsors on a monthly basis to talk about topics that are important to our families. And this month, if you didn't know it, is Mental Health Month. And of course, there are lots of us who know that we are experiencing a mental health crisis, both locally and nationally, and we want to talk a little bit about that this evening. For those of you who would like to use our interpretation services, the link for that will be included in the chat. We have a wonderful panel of speakers this evening, and we will also be monitoring any questions you might have in the chat. And hopefully we'll have time at the end of the conversation also to answer some questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful panel. First is the amazing, wonderful Mary-Beth Landy, who is our Senior Training and Support Specialist for the Recruitment Training and Support Center, which is part of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and supports our special education training and our special education surrogate parents, who are people who are kind enough to offer their services to wards of the state. And as we know, we need a parent voice in every meeting, and so those are people are providing that role. She's been a trainer and a facilitator for the National Alliance of Mental Health, as well as a family partner for the Riverside Community Care, where she's worked with families of children with mental health issues. And she herself is a parent of 2 children who she adopted through the Department of Children and Families. So welcome, Mary-Beth. So happy to be co-facilitating with you today. We also have another dear friend, Meri Viano. Mary is a parent of 3 young children, or I'm sorry, young adults, and raising a grandson. In other words, Mary doesn't sleep, right? She's the associate director of the Parent Professional Advocacy League, which is a statewide, family-run, grassroots nonprofit organization based here in Boston. It is an organization that works with the National Federation of Families for Children with Mental Health. She's worked for PAL for 17 years. And one of the areas that Mary has created and has been instrumental in implementing in PAL is working on relationships with partners in the state to understand racial equity and white privilege. She's worked to support families through leadership trainings and advocacies. Her sons have emotional behavior, trauma, and mental health needs, and her daughter has significant medical needs. And she's also an adoptive parent. So she's a busy lady who is busy at home and also working really hard in our communities, which we really appreciate. So welcome, Mary. It's good to see you again. And last but not least, we have John Crocker. Now, John is joining us via phone while he's driving. So all of us are going to join us in saying that he will drive safely and he will get to where he's going. But we are so excited that he is with us today. John has worked in public education for over a decade, primarily as an administrator at Methuen Public Schools Counseling Department. He's overseen the planning and implementation of the Mental Health Initiative, which is focused on the establishment of a comprehensive school mental health system in partnership with the National Center for School and Mental Health. He's also founded the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium, which is a group of approximately 150 school districts across Massachusetts committing to advocating for and implementing quality and sustainable school mental health services and supports. So welcome, John. We are thrilled to have you join us in this conversation. Many of you sent questions ahead of time. So Mary-Beth is actually going to work with John and Mary to answer those questions. And as I said, I'll be monitoring the chat for any other questions that we might be able to include in the discussion as well. So with that, I will pass that on to the amazing Mary-Beth Landy. Mary-Beth, you're muted.
Yep. I do this enough to know that I shouldn't do that while my phone was ringing. So I apologize for that. Welcome, everyone. I am so happy to be joined by colleagues and friends to discuss this very important topic. As Beth mentioned, it is a crisis in the state as well as in the nation about children's mental health, whether we are talking about a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old, or actually even older than that. So this is a challenge, and I thought who better to have talk to us but Meri Viano, who can speak from a state as well as a parent perspective on this, and John Crocker, who really has the forefront of the state school districts as part of his consortium. There are 170 school districts that are involved with that. That's the number I checked today, John, so I hope it's accurate. The school adjustment counselors come together and work with John, sharing resources and training. John provides training through other organizations. So he really has the pulse of what's happening in the schools across the state. I would like just to put a plug in, if your district is not involved with the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium, I'm going to put a lot of resources and links in the chat, but I will put that in, and I suggest not only to check out their resources, but I also suggest that if you can, you take a look and urge your school district and to become part of John's consortium. So, and I just, before we go, I want to get started. I just want to put in another plug for PAL is hosting their annual conference coming up quite soon on Friday the 19th. It is a virtual conference, so you can come from this comfort of right where you are. You don't even have to get out of your chair till then. So I'm going to put the registration in the chat as well. Thankful for their sponsors that have allowed it to be a free conference for participants this year. So if this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart, as it is for me, please join me. I will be there and join Mary and partaking in this wonderful, amazing conference that they host every year, as well as for work with professionals and parents throughout the year. So I'm going to actually just give it a second to turn it over to Mary to say, is there anything else I did not plug? But can I just mention a little bit what's with the ribbon?
So it is Children's Mental Health Month. This is Children's Mental Health Week. Green is the color, just like you see oftentimes in the Down syndrome community. It is yellow. You will often see in breast cancer awareness. It's pink. Children's mental health is green. And the theme this year is advocate, act, and accept, because we believe that awareness is not enough. We've got to raise it to the next level. So again, yes, it is free. Sign up. It's going to fill up fast. We've got about 100 seats left, but we'd love to have you there. So please sign up as soon as you can and enjoy the many workshops that are also going to be there. We will have a national speaker, and we'll also have live remarks from the Commissioner of the Department of Mental Health, Brooke Doyle. So look forward to hopefully seeing you there.
Great. So Mary, I think let's start with what's happening in the state right now. I know PAL really has the thumb on the heartbeat of the state as far as children's mental health, and what is it looking like?
Well, I think the first thing to talk about is that for families, though we talk about we're almost out of the pandemic, we really feel like we're not out of the pandemic yet. I think that's something that we just really have to recognize. There's a new landscape coming. If you don't know what the roadmap is in Massachusetts, it's something to Google. The roadmap is really going to be the new way that children's behavioral health and mental health services are going to be happening both in the community and at multiple levels. It's really important to know that we want and we know that if parents are doing well, their children have a chance, and parents are stressed. I think you'll hear also from my colleague and friend John Crocker. I think schools are amazing, and they're doing amazing out of the box thinking, and they're stressed within the schools. So I think that as a community, what we're seeing is there are more kids and families stepping forward that have never been known by touching on any service. So that's a new group of people. We have individuals that have been touched by the system that need additional supports and or out of the box opportunities. And then it would not be me if I didn't raise the challenge of the real acuity that we are seeing. I have been in this field well over 20 years in advocacy in many levels, and the acuity of what we are getting from calls from both families and professionals of children that have significant eating disorders, medical needs on top of mental health needs, kids that are on the autism spectrum and have the mental health components of psychiatric needs, and also the youth that are very aggressive. I don't use purposefully the word violent because children have a function to every behavior. I don't often use, and you'll notice within PAL, we don't use behavioral health as a term often because we feel it's parent blaming. So one of the things that we really are trying to shift is both the dialogue, but we have to look at the acuity of the children that need. So I'll just give you one quick snapshot and hand it back to you, Mary-Beth. If you have a heart issue and you go to the emergency department, often we figure it out when we get you on a medical floor. If you're a child that's going to the emergency department or going to receive services, you can wait weeks, days, and months to receive treatment. And though the brain is an important organ, you will wait to receive services. And the state is trying really hard. There's diversion programs in the emergency departments, but the reality is we're not on a similar playing field yet when we look at mental health. I want to get there in my 20 years, and the advocates before me, I want to get there. We're not there yet, and it's even more intense today.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that Mary was mentioning was boarding. It's when a child is brought to the emergency room because they are seeking treatment, and parents sometimes don't know where to bring the child, or even schools will instruct parents or contact people to, and they're told to be bringing the child to the emergency room. Many times that is an emergency room that does not have a pediatric wing to it. So these kids, and they can be 8 years old, are sitting in an emergency room amongst adults who may also be having psychiatric crisis at the time. And they just remain there until a bed can be found in the state. So I think that also speaks to somewhat a systemic issue of we don't have the beds available. And people may not be aware of that as well.
Well, and keep in mind too that we have beds that are not able to be accessed because we have a workforce shortage. So there are beds that are not open yet. The other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on is that we know nationally too that if you remain in an emergency department for more than 72 hours, trauma occurs for that person. So I think we've got to also look at the adverse effects. I will do a shout out, like the roadmap. I often say this is a nugget of information to write down. Community-based health centers, otherwise known as CBHC. That is the way the map will be looking for mental health. So that is a community kind of stop that you would go to get assessed for mental health and not go to an emergency room. They are just being rolled out in the last few months. I would recommend, and just like PAL and the Federation kind of together, and John might add to this too. When you go look at a school, you go to look at a school and you talk to people, you introduce yourself, right? Do this in the medical field and mental health field. Go into the communities, to these community-based health centers, introduce yourself, see what they can do, talk about your family and your needs, and have that be a next step, because it is the way that Massachusetts is rolling out that next step.
Right. People may be familiar with, can you talk a little bit about the difference between that service in the CBHI service, which I think more people are familiar with, the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative, that was, because that's been around now for 12 years, 10,
Right.
12 years.
Right. Yep. A little bit over 12, 13 years. So the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative was something that had started. I often remind people it was the Rosie D lawsuit within the state. Rosie D was a real person. She was a woman that didn't get community access. It's important to a family organization to name that, because the way the map started in Massachusetts was there was a remedy. And the remedy was if you had Medicaid or Mass Health, you could get a group of services like intensive care coordination, a family partner or advocate like myself to work with you, therapeutic mentoring, kind of that mentoring program, and mobile crisis. So right before the pandemic, Massachusetts had been working very hard to get private insurance to pay for these services. Another nugget term is BHCA, BHCA, Behavioral Health Care for Child and Adolescents. That was the term and the reform that happened, that private care insurances then had to step to the plate if it was Massachusetts-based insurance. So if you were a Blue Cross Blue Shield Ohio, nothing against Ohio, but you couldn't often get the services in the Commonwealth. And that really gave an array of services. Right now, CBHI is still available. And I know we had talked about workforce changes. There are also these community-based health centers. The community-based health centers have an array of services directly in them. And I would look them up because they're so different across the board in the state. But you can get groups, you can get some flex services, you can be seen by mobile crisis in the community. And there's also limited beds, very limited beds that haven't fully opened yet for youth and child and adolescents. Keeping in mind, I didn't say that they were specialty beds to the most acute population that we had talked about. So that's important to also talk about in the community. And then the last thing I'll just throw out there is the Behavioral Health Helpline, the BHHL line. It is available 24/7. We would recommend that over some of the other lines only because clinicians are involved. They are brand new and getting started, so I think giving them time, but it's supposed to be info referral. And you can call there and you can ask for information as well. They do some risk assessments, so just be prepared for that. But that is the new hotline that came out of the national work for suicide prevention. So we in Massachusetts chose to have 988 as a suicide crisis line and the BHHL, Behavioral Health Helpline. I would encourage families, right now I think the BHHL is a little bit more open to supporting families' needs with children than what we've heard from the community, because 988 is still coming.
Okay, so you've been mentioning these. I've already got them all pulled up and with links. So I'm putting them in the chat as resources, and that people can save the chat afterwards so that they'll have those resources. I also will be putting in some referral services as well, where people who are looking for therapists for their children can check out some referral services. But let me just jump. Go ahead.
Mary-Beth, can I just say one thing? Everything at PAL is free. There's no eligibility and there's no insurance. There's not a specific intake. That's the most important thing to know within PAL. And like the Federation, diversity and multicultural outreach is very close to our heart, because we know that the barriers are real. And for people that need that level of support, it's even more intense. Parent professionals in our name, school teachers can call professionals. Our staff are savvy, seasoned, and want to think out of the box for the best resources for families. Thank you, Mary-Beth.
Thank you. So I want to talk, I'm going to ask a question that was brought up to us. It's somewhat of a multi-question that was posed to us. And then I also want to jump over to John and have him talk a little bit about how this is manifesting itself within our school districts. So how do we support students who have a disability where the school does not have enough staff to support the children they serve, causing the children to need additional support and not get the help because the school does not have the support staff available? I know Mary's spoken to this. John, do you want to take a moment and jump in and maybe address that?
Sure, yeah. And you can all hear me? Good?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, firstly, so psyched to be here and really appreciate the opportunity. Mary, so good to hear you share all of these wonderful resources and such a rich set of information. So, when there's a short-term answer, there's a long-term answer with this question that's posed in the chat. That the long-term answer is that I do believe that schools are the prevention arm of the mental health system writ large, and there's a very real charge for schools to ultimately build out the capacity to be able to provide mental health services and supports, and also orient to emerging concerns. So when I think about whether or not we're going to be able to address the youth mental health crisis, that question really hinges on whether or not community and school-based mental health services are working in concert. It is not the case that we can rely only on community-based mental health to be the solution. It definitely has to be an all-hands-on-deck kind of an approach. So long-term, I do think developing comprehensive school mental health systems where we have school-based mental health services that are occurring during the school day and that extend into the community to allow for augmentation of care. That's essential. And universal mental health screening is a piece of that. I'm sure that will come up at some point during this conversation. In the short term, I think that we are in a huge crisis here, and I don't think it's uncommon to see things like 18 to 24 month wait lists. It's absolutely absurd. So the question of like, well, how do we get care if the school is not able to provide care? I do think that, Mary brought up the behavioral health helpline. I think that is a piece of the solution for sure. I think that, encouraging districts to partner with community-based mental health agencies, if in the absence of internal mental health services that can be provided, but it is not I think unfortunately this is not a solution that can be enacted overnight. And the urgency that I want to kind of instill in people is that if we have to build capacity within schools. It cannot be the case that we have a refer and hope model. Otherwise, we're going to end up with situations that are being raised in the chat where ultimately we are in a place where we're trying to rely on a system of support that's simply outstripped at this point. And I have great appreciation for and respect for community-based mental health. And I also know that it is just simply not the case that they can bear the weight of the youth mental health crisis, where we're seeing 2 to 3 times greater prevalence rates of anxiety, depression, trauma. So food for thought there, some short-term solutions, but the long-term is definitely the development of this system of supports within schools.
I totally agree with that. And I think, as Beth had mentioned earlier, we certainly are at a state where there was, I feel, a mental health crisis prior to COVID, and then COVID just kind of blew us out of the water. You mentioned too before, Mary, about the intersect of physical special needs as well as, or health special needs, as well as the mental health, because I'm not sure how many people may think of it in this way. So I have a 14-year-old, I have 2 older kids and then a 14-year-old. She has severe anxiety and depression, which manifested into an eating disorder. So we've gone from psychological challenges that have developed into physical challenges, which have now led to a seizure disorder. So the mind body are not 2 separate things. They are really one thing. So it is interesting to see the difference and we have been very helpful, hopeful and helpful with getting providers to all speak to each other, so that the therapists know when there's been a seizure, as well as the neurologist knows, and the neurologist knows what the meds are, and it's a 24-hour day job, keeping all that sort of things tracked out. But I think that COVID so drastically affected so many different communities, and not in a, we're not talking about in an equitable way. We are talking about marginalized communities were certainly hit more so than other communities within the state. And I think that has made it even more difficult. We had the difficulty when COVID hit and having kids be able to get access to classrooms because of whether families had access to internet services or good internet services, that specific thing. But I think we also, and health, getting health services as well as complicated that and exacerbated the mental health of both parents and children. And then we move into, all of a sudden, we're going back into school systems and we're seeing, we're putting eyes on these kids in a way that hadn't been done in the last 3 years. I will do a little shout out for the nurses in school districts, which I think sometimes are not misrepresent. They are not given as much acknowledgement sometimes as they should, because I know that for many times and I say this all the time for people who do have kids in the system or having struggles, sometimes they're the front line for these kids. The kids end up, not feeling well. Our frequent flyers for the nurse's office. The kids sometimes are known better by the nurse than they are sometimes by the person they see once a week, because they're in the nurse's office so often. I think of them almost as a hairdresser. The kids will tell them anything. So, bringing that in as well, bringing them into part of the conversations that we're having, because they're being relied on a lot. And I think, Mary, you're shaking your head. Your thoughts on that as well?
So one of the things that I just want to kind of two things that came up for me is that young people and kids within schools trust lots of different people, right? It could be the school nurse, it could be the janitor, it could be the secretary, it could be the lunch person, right? Whomever that kind of is that they trust is who they trust. So I think schools are trying really hard to think out of the box on what is the connection for this young person, what is the strength to be able to do that. The other challenge is that we have to be real. Teachers are not clinicians. They are not doctors. They don't know all about the brain, and they're trying hard, right? And they've come out of a pandemic as well. So I think we often hear when we talk with police officers, I didn't know I was going to be a clinician that went to a home, right? Like that's not what I went. I'm going for safety, but why am I being called to a home with a kid that has a significant mental health need when my goal is to keep the community safe and to do an arrest? We don't want kids arrested, right? That's just the reality. The other thing that came up for me really clearly is that we need the professionals, we need the people side by side with the parents to say, we need different, we need better. The most vulnerable of children are going into sometimes care and have different levels of trauma, abuse, and neglect within the system itself. So we've got to work together to kind of pull that together. It is another piece that comes up for me. I think schools are trying to think out of the box, and I think that with so many new, and John said this, right? That often he sees the preventative piece that just directly comes in to the schools, then schools can be the preventative place that really are going to deal with it first. One of the things that, and I agree with John, often they're coming there. And I think schools are also, trying really hard to figure out when is this more supports that needed, because we don't need more 51As from the community or the schools or child requiring assistance. It's just, it doesn't work. We have a lot of kids that also, I think schools are trying to think out of the box on school avoidance. There's a function to every behavior with kids, right? Like John's drank this Kool-Aid. Many of the people in his community love how you echoed, Mary-Beth. If you're a school that doesn't know the coalition, join into that because we need the power to be with the message.
Absolutely. So John, you're, and I, again, thank you for doing this while you're in the midst of traveling. That's stressful enough, but to talk about kids' mental health just kind of adds on to it. So do you have any idea, John, how schools are looking at helping with the staff shortages within schools? I know we're trying to think out of the boxes, even as far as educators and special educators, but what is happening in the schools as far as clinicians is concerned?
There's been a huge investment in hiring more school counselors, adjustment counselors, social workers, school psychologists, which I truly appreciate. I think that an investment in more is important, but I also am a little bit, I get worried when we, rely on grant funding to put positions into play when we know that's going to dry up pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
And the second piece that I want to raise is that it is not a value add to put a bunch of mental health staff into a district that does not leverage mental health staff well. If we put let's add a couple counselors to a district that doesn't use counselors effectively, that's not going to help kids. I think we need to position our mental health staff well, resource them, provide them the PD, training, coaching, clinical supervision necessary to be able to do the job. And a lot of times what I see missing is that there's a massive dearth of clinical leadership that extends into school districts. 70%-ish of districts across Massachusetts do not have an administrator who provides clinical supervision or who has a seat at the table relative to any kind of mental health and SEL initiative. So what that means is that the vast majority of the internal mental health staff that schools and districts rely on are really going it alone, or they're being supervised and evaluated by individuals who are trying their best. I want to give them a ton of support. Associate principals who are being asked to supervise and evaluate mental health staff. That's just not fair to begin with, but they're doing their absolute best. And, I often give the example of like tomorrow, if all of the English department chairs in the state were dispatched to supervise and evaluate the math department in districts, people would be up in arms. They would be really upset. But we're totally cool with a non-clinical administrator supervising and evaluating mental health staff. That's really weird. I'd be a terrible supervisor of the science department at the high school, despite my affinity for science. I don't have the pedagogical skill to move practice for science teachers. I can provide clinical supervision. So, a lot of times what I see is that we're actually not leveraging the mental health staff that we currently have as effectively as we could. And that means that we're starting from we're operating from a standpoint of the illusion of staff being used effectively. So we just kind of keep adding on, and it's not doing much because we haven't deployed them well or trained them or given them the resources they need.
Yeah, I think that's key, that if you're not utilizing the staff, or they're not feeling as if this is being taken by the top down, implement that tiered system of support coming from the top down as opposed to the bottom up, that can be frustrating and can lead to some issues around retention of staff once you do have people, because we're talking about there's a challenge that is different when we're talking about working with children. When you're looking for a clinician, you want a clinician that is trained and understands children's brains and neurology and the effects of development of the brain. We were talking about that earlier today in a session, that our kids have gone through a period of 3 years where they are stunted in that development because they didn't have the interactions to be able to continue to develop socially and emotionally. But then on top of that, having a staff that was trying so desperately to do, care over computers. And I even tell my own therapist, who I do see telehealth, that I have to at least see her. I don't like phone calls because I need that face-to-face, because you can't pick up nuances. You can't pick up things you need to see. And so many times we place the responsibility on our staff, school staffs, particularly the counselors, to pick up on things that we may not necessarily have the training of the background as parents to have a scope of understanding about that. And I'm sure that a lot of that comes through in phone calls that PAL gets. We get that in the phone calls that people have at the Federation, is trying to understand the whole, each system. There's so many systems involved here. So the school system, the Department of Mental Health, that people don't understand how to deal with them and what they can provide, and in-home therapy and all these different aspects. And I think someone, Jenny, had put in the chat about needing to have systems that are more proactive instead of reactive, is definitely, I think, key. And that's one of the things that I love about the consortium, is that John and his team together are working to proactively support the providers within districts, to be able to know how to look out for, how to assess where a child is, know what resources are available within the district and outside of the district, and have a greater understanding as how to work with families. As Mary mentioned, as someone else did, about how to work with parents and be involved with parents. because they too are experts in their own child. They may not necessarily know the name of all the diagnosis and the clinical codes and billing information, but they certainly know when something's not right, and need some help and support with that. So, and when I did put in the PAL resource in the chat, that is the request for information, request for helpline. So that is directly there. Thank you, John. I'm so happy to see you.
You know, one of the things I also want to just add, Mary-Beth, is that everybody needs colleagues. And I know John probably, I think, would say this to me as well. If I have a school that comes forward to me and is stuck, John is accessible. He'll talk with people about, like, let's figure this out, what's going on in the district, right? Because a teacher or somebody within a school may come to me. The same thing would go to the schools if there was a struggle with communicating, supporting a parent, maybe not understanding the need that the parent is saying they need for their kid. I'm going to hear from the community that John has to say, hey, is there a way PAL could really work with this family? We want to work with the school because it's a whole child approach. The student ends it too. We're talking about children. And this project that I think John and I think PAL and the Federation and other groups of people, we need all of, I think, the resources to tap on, right? But you also need your group of colleagues to be able to go to. And the last thing I'll say is that you've got to access things in your own community. People don't have the transportation, the money within their own homes, right, to travel for long periods of time. Transportation may not even be accessible. So it's got to be in their community. We've got to figure it out. And I think that's another thing that PAL has always really wanted to work is directly within the communities to say, what do you have locally? What can we get? Because if a child is happy, even for 5 minutes, there's a success that we're going to get to that next step. Now, does a child happiness for 5 minutes mean they don't need hospitalization? They don't need an intervention of mental health? I'm not taking that away. I'm not making it light. But I think that the stress level and the impact it's had is pretty intensive.
I definitely agree. I'm sorry, I'm also checking the chat at the same time. I did want, you just had mentioned something. I think sometimes people aren't aware of the fact that throughout the state of Massachusetts, there are, we're up to 30, maybe 33, someone correct me if I'm wrong, family resource centers that are funded through the state. They have school liaisons, school support specialists within the organization. Now there is also an agency, Health Law Advocates. People probably are not familiar with them. They're a small but powerful group that I happen to personally love. They are attorneys. It's Health Law Advocates. They are, if they're not already, most of the family resource centers have an attorney who works out of their offices, and they work with, if you're looking for help for your child with a mental health issue as far as school is concerned, they're really the recommendation of a go-to. They understand it. I will put that in the chat as well, Health Law Advocates. But the other thing is that the family resource centers provide a space. They're in a location that's usually publicly accessible by transportation, that families can come and gather and get multiple supports all at the same time. So a plug for that. If you are, sorry, that's my 14-year-old. You can kind of tell by the ring. I encourage people to reach out and find out what their family resource center is. And it's not in every town, but there are in every area of the state. And someone also mentioned, someone talking about it's hard to find supports in Western Mass. And Western Mass is a large area. Many people think Worcester's in Western Mass, which is technically Central Mass, but everything past Worcester, many times people think of as this dead zone, when in fact the need is so great, and sometimes even the smallest of communities, because they don't have public transportation, they don't have the same access. So there's a lot of poverty out in the western part of the state. And that is something also that comes up in the comments and questions about the marginalized communities in many different ways. what are some ways that we as members of the community can also assist in that process of trying to help families get the resources that they need? Many people brought that up, that, how can we help? John,
So
I'll start.
I don't know, John,
either
if you
one.
want to start or if you want me to jump in.
I'll go for it, Mary.
Okay, so I think in the schools, I think parent advisory groups are really important right across, and do things, shout out to Leslie at the Federation. I think that we're seeing, there was one community, I'll just give you an example. My daughter's 24 years old and has a medical disability and Down syndrome. I often showed up to the, my son is 29 years old with significant mental health needs. 7 diagnoses that we don't need to get into, but that's kind of what life has brought. Every time in those years, 20 years ago, I would show up and there would be families that had children with intellectual disabilities or medical needs. There wasn't the parents that were connected to mental health. Well, recently a school district held a meeting and 100 parents showed up. 100 parents showed up, and they want to talk about the needs, not just what's not working in schools. What do we need in schools? What do we do to be part of the solution in schools? But there's not the PTO, parent kind of teacher organization for kids that have different needs and different unique abilities. But the parent advisory groups is the places to go. If there's not one, let's figure it out and make it. So I think the numbers is important. The teachers, shout out for Teacher Appreciation Week, right? That's this week. Remember your teachers, but also remember they want to partner with you for the change, but often it takes a village to make that shift. That's one place. Second place for me, legislatively. We've got to get involved with legislative advocacy. Shout out to the autism community. Boy, do they show up. And when they show up in big numbers, right? To be able to make the shifts. We need parents that have children with bipolar, trauma, grief. We need you to show up. We need you to do letter writing to legislature to say what's needed. There's a lot of school bills right now that are up for technical assistance to give the professional development that John was talking about. PAL is part of the Children's Mental Health Campaign. We're in that kind of legislative place. We're also trying to really work to make sure that kids can work on the problems together, and we're not policing schools. We want safe schools, but we don't believe that police is the right answer. So I think that the legislative component, it's not as scary as it seems. I would make a shout out to the Mass Families. Mass Families is a great organization. Connect. PAL is here, Federation for Children with Special Needs, many different communities, but it's not about, I advocate for kids. Yeah, I always said when my kids got older, I still advocated that I thought that kindergarten should be universal in preschool, right? It was important to me. My kids maybe do not have autism. My nephew and niece do, but one of the things I do is I champion those bills too, because it is a priority. We need people to prioritize the mental health bills as well, but we need the parents and we need the professionals to show up and say, we're not satisfied with what we have. This is what we need. Goes back to Jenny's comment on what do we need to be proactive. We've got to really reform together. We've got to make the shift. There's money that's coming and we've got to demand, what do we need in partnership? Don't listen to the demand and say it's adversarial. We've got a partner to make it better.
Mm-hmm. And John, I think she's right. There's a lot of things that are affecting the school districts, and I think sometimes we forget on the local level to advocate as well. Show up for your school committee meetings. Ask those questions. I know that Leslie is always encouraging CPACs to
Right.
Bring the voice. And I don't know that a lot of people, you're right. I think there's certain different parent groups that are more vocal than others. And it's sometimes hard to walk into that CPAC and say, my kid doesn't have autism. They have, they're bipolar, or something like that. How are some other ways that maybe school districts or people that of in your network, coming together and trying to bring change through that advocacy aspect?
Yeah, no, it's an awesome question. And I think Mary brought up some awesome points. ultimately, a call back to something that I said earlier on, we have to establish these systems of support locally. It's not going to be the case that we can rely on regional networks solely, or community-based agencies solely, to be able to address youth mental health crisis. They are a massive part of the solution. I want to honor that, but it's also the case that we have, just as an example, there are 2,500 plus school counselors dispatched across the state, already embedded in buildings, already positioned to provide mental health services and supports to kids. And I guess my question would be, to what degree are they currently being leveraged to do that? If they're not, then that's a problem. We need to stand up systems of support that will deploy these mental health staff effectively. And I'd say the same about adjustment counselors and social workers and school psychologists. And I got to, take a big step back and say, all of those individuals are embedded within a much larger system of supports that we have to turn on, and we have to ensure that it's well resourced, and that there's a thoughtful and intentional design of services and supports that these individuals are providing. So there's that system build is requisite to be able to get to all the kids. And then, how do we ensure that there's advocacy efforts, that we're ensuring that, at a local level and a state level, that we're moving forward. I do think that there's a massive amount of work that has to be done with the legislature. Mary, you pointed this out, that there is advocacy that can occur. I feel very blessed. Actually, just this past Tuesday, I was at the State House at an event with the Baker Center to be able to release a policy recommendation guide. I'm going to drop that in the chat for people that want to fall asleep very quickly on a Friday night. I would recommend reading this with a big bowl of popcorn, and you will be out in 10 minutes. It's 80 pages of research. So the idea here, though, is that it is providing an opportunity for us to highlight policy recommendations that will directly impact school mental health. And if we don't have that kind of a voice, and if we don't try to change the way we've been thinking for the past 10, 20, 30 years around school mental health, then ultimately our efforts at the local level may fall short because it's not backed by legislation. One of the pieces that I'm working on right now is a piece of legislation that will provide some opportunity for parity between community-based mental health staff and school counselors. And the idea behind it is that right now, if you work in a school and you want to get a dual license, you have to quit your job, go back to school, and get a duplicate master's degree that you may have just completed, and try to attempt to get supervision hours, but not in a school because that's not approved. And my issue there is that causes a huge amount of gatekeeping between contexts. We don't get to appropriately leverage school and community-based mental health staff effectively. And we also don't get to tap into school-based Medicaid claiming, which is one of the pieces that will allow for us to have a consistent funding stream for schools. So all that to be said, there's a lot of legislative work to be done to improve the systems of support. On the local level, we've put together a mental health parent student advisory council, which was a partner organization to our CPAC, which allowed for us to get a lot of language and nuance and perspective around what we did from our parents, from our kids. Some of the best work that we did around screening actually came from that mental health parent student advisory council. We asked our kids, like, what do you like about this and what do you not like about it? Do you even understand why we do it? And I think probably the document that I appreciate the most that came out of that experience was an FAQ page that was essentially written by the kids' questions that allowed for us to get ahead of the why of screening and boost engagement in screening in a way that made it safe for kids, because they could ultimately understand what it was for and what it was ultimately not for. Last piece I'll say around this idea of really ensuring that kids get what they need locally and that we're advocating for all these things to happen is that we recognize that we, and this is fairly recently, that, over the past 10 years, we had built out this comprehensive system of supports for kids that included individual and group therapy, true group therapy, CBT, screening, lots of trauma sensitive practices, SEL, mental health literacy, all this wonderful stuff. And a ton of people didn't know about it. Our kids didn't know about it necessarily. Our parents didn't necessarily know about it. And one of the things that we ended up having to invest in was a marketing and advertising campaign. It felt strange to invest money in marketing and advertising as a mental health provider. I definitely didn't get into the field thinking I was going to be, working with a marketing agency, but I recognized that it was an attempt at developing a better set of resources to promote access to services. If we do a good job of marketing and advertising our services, we're promoting access to those services. So we've developed a lot of language and print that will allow for us to improve students' understanding and families' understanding, and ultimately their access to the things that we provide, so that we can feel good about our reach into the community.
Great, thank you, John. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to turn it back to Beth. But before I do, I think one of the things that we've all talked about is the stress that this puts on families and parents. And it is hard. It's being a parent is hard enough, but as I like a meme that recently, trying to figure out what you're going to cook for dinner for the next 18 years is not an easy task, let alone everything else that comes along with parenting. But I do want to just put out one particular plug, because our wonderful Beth Bostic has been a guest on this podcast. There is a podcast called A Little Easier, and it is for parents, stressed parents, basically. Is about parent well-being. And Beth has been a guest on the podcast, so I am going to put that in the chat there. So check out the series of them, and because I do think that they get to a variety of different types of stress as far as parents are concerned, and special needs being one of them. But with that, Beth, I turn it back to you.
Can I just say one quick thing, Beth?
Sure.
I see a lot of people here online, and families are defined in very different ways. There may be a two-parent home and only one can work. It may be a grandparent raising a grandchild. It may be an aunt raising somebody, right? It may be the family that was chosen by a child or family that's doing that. So I see a lot of possible grandparents with us, mixed families of different things. So I want to recognize too that allow families to define who they are, right? Everywhere across the board, from culture, family culture to ethnic culture, embrace it. And if not, become the teacher of it, because we need you to make the path easier for the next family. It's always a pleasure to be with you, but especially I love showing up with John and causing some chaos of our own.
This is kind of like a fun.
This is a great group.
Here.
Yes. And thank you so much for that, Mary. I mean, that is the hallmark of our Massachusetts family engagement frameworks, right? The families are defined by the families themselves and by the child themselves. And so we really need to be conscious of the fact that it can show up in a lot of different ways. And it really comes down to who cares about the kid, who's actually at the table, really willing to do the work. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody. John, it was a pleasure to meet you for the first time. I'm amazed at the number of times I've been in Methuen on many cases, and you and I haven't crossed paths yet again, but I'm sure that will change sometime in the future. And Mary, it's always a joy to spend time with you. Mary-Beth, I'm so glad we got to collaborate on this. I'm going to give one last plug for the PAL conference. And if someone could take that from the beginning of the chat and put it at the end so that people
I'm
can
doing
register
that
for
right
it.
now.
Thank you very much, because it is not often that I can say that there is a conference that is free, that is worth your time. So please make sure that you take advantage of that amazing resource and the other resources that are available through PAL. There is a dedicated group of people there who are so invested in positioning families to be successful and positioning children to get the services that they need. And of course, her partner in crime over here, John Crocker, who's doing so much work in the school districts. And as we know, as he said, that's our first line of defense. That's where kids are the most. And we need to make sure that the resources are available for our clinical professionals and also for our teaching teams to make sure we can support these children to grow up and be all that they're supposed to be. So thank you for joining us this evening. So appreciate this conversation. And just a reminder to everyone, here at the Federation, we are here to support you in any way that we can. So please, if you happen to have a child who is going through some changes with mental health, we are here to do everything we can to point you towards the resources that are available. And if we don't know where they are, we will find them for you and make sure we get back to you. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to talking with everyone about more important topics as the year goes on. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, John.
We can stop the recording now.